What would you say to those defense team members and their families who will soon have access to the COVID-19 vaccine?
The next step in bringing us towards the end of that pandemic is the vaccine.
Pardon, Mr. Prime Minister. Welcome aboard Interpret Ottawa.
They were essentially told by the Prime Minister's office to do this, even though the military said, we think this is an unlawful order. Canadian Armed Forces leadership and the Prime Minister's office were shocked that this review committee found that the mandate was unconstitutional. I hear that they want to try to appeal it.
Alexa Lavoie here reporting for Ribbon News, and today we have a gripping interview with Philippe Millars, a prominent legal advocate who has been at the forefront of representing numerous Canadian military members in their legal fights against vaccine mandate. Philippe Millars brings a unique perspective to the table, having served in the military himself. Now, he stands as a staunch defender of the rights of those who are facing discrimination and threat due to political policies. One of his most noteworthy clients is Adjuvant James Top, a reservist who found himself facing a court-martial for openly criticizing the policy while in uniform.
When you look at the role of the Canadian Armed Forces is defend the security of the nation, and you have to ask yourself why. Because we want the people there to have secure, successful, and happy lives.
But that's not all. We have also heard from Dallas Alexander Flamand, a former sniper in the Canadian Armed Force, who shared his harrowing experience of intimidation and threat from his superior. If you missed my interview with him, I highly recommend you give it a watch. Recently, the External Review Committee on Military Grievance delivered a bombshell conclusion. They suggested that the implementation of the COVID-19 vaccination policy within the Canadian Armed Force might have run afoul of the rights guaranteed by the Charter for some members. The big question now looms: will the Canadian Force challenge these claims put forth by the CEE-GM? To delve deeper into this crucial matter, let's hear directly from lawyer Philippe Millars. He will shed light on the legal intricacies and the potential implication of this landmark case.
The military members were being kicked out of the Canadian Forces for not following a lawful order, but they never charged them with not following a lawful order. They just administratively released them and said the reason they're being released is they didn't follow a lawful order. And then 150 members had put in grievances, which is a separate body of the Canadian Forces that deals with a service member who wants to appeal a decision of the military. So it's not a court, but it's a grievance review committee whose job is to deal with these types of issues. And I think Canadian Armed Forces leadership and the Prime Minister's office were shocked that this review committee, which is not a court, but it's a committee that kind of adjudicates these grievances, found that the mandate was unconstitutional. I hear that they want to try to appeal it, but the ball is in the Chief of Defense Staff's court now to accept it and let these people come back into the military or pay them because they were treated unfairly. You know, usually what happens when it's not a political issue is that when they find this, the soldiers get what they asked for, right? But in this particular case, because there's so much politics behind what the Chief of Defense Staff is doing, he's dragging his feet, and the indications we're getting is he's going to appeal it. So he's been given a way to kind of fix this for the soldiers who were treated unfairly. And it looks like he's not taking that opportunity to treat them fairly. The military knew this was an illegal order if they did the mandate, and they went ahead otherwise. And they were essentially told by the Prime Minister's office to do this, even though the military said, we think this is an unlawful order. But what was outrageous to me is some service members wanted to say they had a religious exemption from taking the vaccine, which has happened in the past. And then that service member just gets moved somewhere else. Like, let's say somebody's deploying over to Africa and they don't want to get a vaccine. They say, I have a religious exemption, and they don't get kicked out of the military. They just don't go to Africa, because you're not going to send somebody into Central Africa without, an Ebola vaccine. In this particular case, though, what they did is there's a general who is the chief chaplain. So the chief medical spiritual advisor, it's called the chaplain general. We know that there was directions coming from the chief chaplain to all of the chaplains of all denominations, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, issued direction not to accept a spiritual exemption for the vaccine. So there was one avenue open to members, is that if they had an exemption for religious purposes, they wouldn't have to take the vaccine. But from the highest levels of the Canadian Armed Forces, there was direction to tell people of all faiths that they would not be granted a spiritual exemption. And it's interesting, because how do you tell somebody what their spirituality is from the chain of command? It's a deliberate political interference into the very private spiritual positions that our members had. And so very few people, but before that direction came, it's hilarious. There was two twin brothers in the Canadian Forces who both claimed the same spiritual exemption. One was in Quebec and one was in Ontario. One was given it and one wasn't, which is hilarious when you think about it. But then in the end, they ended up taking away the one who got it, because they just were intense on not letting anybody avoid the vaccine mandate. So in the redress of grievances, the service members said that being forced to take a mandate unilaterally was an infringement on their Section 7 rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let's say, for example, there was a bad Ebola virus in Canada. It was killing 95% of the people who got it. The government could mandate that everybody get a vaccine, because it's just so important to the survival of our society. And so you could infringe on Section 7 because it's beneficial to society. But in this case, the military insisted on a mandate when it wasn't necessary. The committee found that it was overly broad. It's ridiculous that people who had COVID were forced to take the vaccine when they had equivalent immunity. So somebody who had COVID and recovered was equal in all science to somebody who had 2 shots. And yet those service members who served Canada for so many years were kicked out of the forces because they didn't take the pharmaceutical product, even though they had the same immunity. And the committee found that the government's policy was overly broad, was unjustified, and there were other ways to achieve the aim without insisting on everybody take these needles.
Do you have any hope that can be win again in appeal?
Yeah, and so there's a professor at the University of Ottawa who it looks like is getting paid by somebody to be so pro-pharma, because, this guy is on TV arguing that other provinces had a similar challenge to a mandate.
What you do affects others' liberty and others' security of the person. And for that reason, they held that they could not say that they had been infringed so much that it was a violation of the Charter rights.
And it was successful, but the provinces aren't binding authority. It might have to go to the Supreme Court. But the point for, I think, your listeners is that the Canadian Armed Forces has a mandate to protect Canada. And we kicked out 400 soldiers, sailors, and Air Force people who had decades of training. They're almost irreplaceable. Canadian Forces has a huge manpower shortage, and they kicked them all out because politically Trudeau wanted to set an example. And so we lost crucial resources necessary for Canada's defense. And they redressed it through the committee, saying this was unfair. And the independent committee has now come back to Canadian Forces and said that was unconstitutional. You shouldn't have kicked them out. The Chief of Defense Staff, if he's not a coward, if he's not just focused on pleasing Trudeau and his minions, should say, okay, we've got this. Let's bring them back in. The problem is he's taking direction from the Prime Minister's office. And that's what burns my ass, is he's supposed to take care of the soldiers. And our generals listen to the Prime Minister when it comes to missions, But in this case, he could totally give all of those soldiers justice. I haven't seen it be appealed like this before. They're just going to delay it and wear down these soldiers. And it might have to go into a court system outside of the control of the Prime Minister's office before they get justice. But the Chief of Defense Staff could fix it today and say, accept the findings of the External Review Committee. I'm going to reinstate the soldiers who were kicked out, give them their life back, and apologize to them. I think what militaries need are strong leaders who protect their soldiers. And what I would have done if I was the Chief of Defense Staff and received that direction from the Prime Minister's office is I would have resigned. Like, I would have made it into an issue. That's the only thing politicians respond to. But if you have leaders who just bend over and who won't fall on their sword for the right thing, then the politicians will do more and more. I haven't seen anything in the kind of 35 years in which I've served in the military and have been a lawyer that was so obviously wrong and yet was forced down the throats of Canadians as the vaccine mandate imposed upon our Canadian brave soldiers. You kind of leave your identity at the door. You join the military, you get stripped of your identity, you get broken down, and they build you back up into a new organism that has bonds with your fellow soldiers. You're committed to the nation. It's what makes you able to fight as a cohesive unit overseas. What the military has done now by accepting woke policies across the board is they're teaching people on recruit school about, how bad the system is, they're kind of focusing on identity, which undermines operational effectiveness. And what that does is, when you're trying to recruit people to defend our nation, it's a certain type of person that wants to defend our nation. It's not a Starbucks barista with blue hair. Like, they might like the diversity element now that's in the military, but I can't ask one of those people to jump out of a plane behind enemy lines and engage in a firefight in the middle of the night. Like, you need special types of people to join the military or to join the Navy and sail across the oceans or be in a submarine. The problem is we've allowed political wokeness to take control of the military, and that's why nobody's joining. It's a tough life in which you sacrifice for a greater good, and you have to inspire people to want to sacrifice in order to get them to join. And instead, we're just becoming, a politically correct commercial about friendliness. And the problem is, the next conflict theater we go into, we could be in real big trouble. We have no ability to help if Ukraine goes south. And a lot of our senior leaders have been gutted because we've fired anybody who ever had a complaint against them. And now we have a bunch of people in charge of our military who've never seen the business end of a rifle. Whether you like them or not, let's say you're a very liberal person who believes in all the social agenda. You enjoy that safety to have this, because there are people who you might not like willing to be shot, to be dirty, to be cold, to be hungry, who are prepared to protect the safe environment you have at Starbucks. And when they see these things about gender inclusivity and I can wear whatever uniform I want, it actually pushes away the people who are prepared to die for the country. But I would just beg the senior leadership of the Canadian Forces to accept this finding, bring those soldiers back, apologize, and set the conditions to fix what's going on in the Canadian Forces. Like, it's an opportunity to try to heal what's happened. But if they just continue down this road, I worry for the future of the Canadian Armed Forces.
The discrimination related with the vaccine is not finished yet. And we are still fighting along with some Canadians with the unjustified fine they received during the pandemic period. But we need your help. It's not cheap to fight this in court. Lawyer is pretty expensive. If you want to donate and you want to contribute to that fight, go over fightvaccinepassport.com. On this website, you can donate what you can to help all the Canadians that we are fighting along with them. They're unjust fine. So please go over fightvaccinepassport.com and make a donation. And thank you in advance for all your donation. Thanks.